There is a reason disagreement feels uncomfortable. There is a reason social rejection feels painful. There is a reason people will silence themselves in a room full of others even when they know something is wrong. It is not weakness. It is biology. Before you were an individual, you were a mammal. And before you were a mammal capable of abstract reasoning, you were an organism whose survival depended entirely on group inclusion. For most of human history, isolation was not an inconvenience. It was death. Imagine early humans scattered across open land. Predators were real. Weather was real. Starvation was real. A lone human had almost no chance of long-term survival. But a group could hunt. A group could defend. A group could share warmth. A group could transmit knowledge. So evolution favored not just intelligence, but attachment. Your nervous system learned a simple equation. Belonging equals survival. Rejection equals threat. That equation still runs in the background of your psychology today. Even in modern cities. Even in digital spaces. Even in professional environments. Your brain does not fully distinguish between social exclusion and physical danger. Because for most of your species' history, they were the same. Modern neuroscience has demonstrated something profound. The same neural circuitry activated by physical pain is activated during social rejection. When someone excludes you. When you are humiliated. When you are publicly shamed. When you sense disapproval. Your brain reacts as if something is physically wrong. Why? Because from an evolutionary standpoint, something is wrong. To be cast out from the group historically meant exposure, vulnerability, and eventual death. So the body learned to interpret social exclusion as an emergency. This is why public embarrassment feels unbearable. Social media backlash can cause panic. Being ignored by a group triggers anxiety. Disagreement feels threatening rather than neutral. It is not about ego in the beginning. It is about survival coding. When people conform to a group opinion that is obviously incorrect, observers often assume ignorance. But conformity is rarely about intellectual inability. It is about social calculus. The mind is constantly scanning. If I disagree, what happens? If I stand alone, what happens? If I challenge authority, what happens? Even if the calculation is unconscious, it exists. And often the answer, at least emotionally, is standing alone feels dangerous. So the individual adjusts. Not because the group is correct, but because the cost of isolation feels too high. This is why intelligent individuals can remain silent inside flawed systems. The threat is not intellectual defeat. The threat is social exile. Humans are exquisitely sensitive to consensus. If 5 people in a room confidently assert something, the 6th begins to doubt their own perception. Not because reality changed, but because confidence signals safety. Agreement signals belonging. And belonging signals survival. The brain often asks a hidden question. Is it safer to be right alone, or wrong together? For most of human evolution, the answer was clear. Wrong together was safer. So we evolved a bias toward agreement. Not truth. Agreement. Before a child develops a personal philosophy, they absorb a collective one. Family, community, culture, religion, language, custom. Beliefs are inherited long before they are examined. Why? Because alignment with the group ensures inclusion. Inclusion ensures protection. Protection ensures continuity. So the young mind learns. To question too early risks disconnection. This is why early conditioning is powerful. It is fused with safety. Beliefs are not just ideas. They are attachments to belonging. To stand alone psychologically requires overriding ancient wiring. When someone challenges group consensus, they feel tension, increased heart rate, tightness in the chest, anxiety, hyper-awareness. The body reacts before the intellect finishes forming its argument. Because isolation historically meant vulnerability. This is why whistleblowers suffer, why dissenters feel drained, why independent thinkers often experience loneliness. It is not merely social discomfort. It is nervous system resistance to perceived exile. The world has changed. Your wiring has not. Today, tribes are not limited to physical proximity. They are ideological, digital, political, professional, cultural. Online communities activate the same tribal circuitry as prehistoric clans. Agreement earns validation. Disagreement invites exclusion. Likes and shares mimic approval signals. Public criticism mimics threat. Your nervous system does not differentiate between being banished from a village and being ostracized online. The threat response is similar. The evolutionary programming remains intact. Belonging offers safety, but it demands alignment. And alignment can demand silence. Over time, individuals begin adjusting, softening opinions, avoiding controversy, mirroring language, adopting group vocabulary, repeating shared narratives. This does not always happen consciously. Gradually, the self bends. And because the adaptation reduces anxiety, it feels correct. Safety feels like truth. But safety and truth are not the same. At its core, conformity is not about weakness. It is about risk management. The psyche constantly balances two forces: the need for authenticity, the need for belonging. When belonging feels threatened, authenticity often retreats. Because survival systems outrank intellectual ideals. This is why revolutions are rare. Why dissent is costly. Why conformity is common. It is easier to agree than to isolate. It is easier to belong than to confront. It is easier to merge than to stand alone. Understanding the herd instinct does not require rejecting society. It requires recognizing the force. When you feel hesitation before speaking, when you soften a belief to maintain harmony, when you avoid discomfort to preserve approval, pause. Ask, is this alignment coming from clarity or from fear of exclusion? The first step toward psychological sovereignty is not rebellion. It is awareness of the biological pull. You are not broken for wanting to belong. You are human. But once you see the instinct, you can decide when to follow it and when to stand apart. Chapter 2: Authority and Obedience: Why We Submit to Power. There is a quiet fantasy most people hold about themselves. If it got serious, I'd resist. If someone crossed the line, I'd speak up. If an authority figure told me to do something wrong, I'd refuse. That fantasy feels comforting because it protects your self-image. But mass psychology isn't built on fantasies. It's built on patterns. And the pattern is this: most people obey. Not because they are evil. Not because they are stupid. Not because they lack morals. They obey because authority triggers ancient psychological mechanisms designed to keep you safe inside a hierarchy. And when those mechanisms are activated, your moral reasoning often becomes secondary. To understand obedience, you have to understand what authority represents to the nervous system. In early human groups, hierarchy was not optional. Every group had leaders who coordinated, elders who knew, skilled members who guided, dominant individuals who controlled access. Hierarchy provided structure. Structure reduced chaos. Chaos was dangerous. So your brain evolved a shortcut. Authority equals order. Order equals safety. That shortcut persists. even when the authority is wrong, even when the authority is corrupt, even when the authority is incompetent. The signal of authority still produces a gravitational pull. Obedience is not merely following orders. It is a psychological transfer of agency. When someone is perceived as legitimate authority, a subtle internal shift occurs. They know better. They're responsible. It's not on me. I'm just doing my part. This shift reduces anxiety, because full responsibility is heavy. Responsibility means uncertainty. Uncertainty means risk. Risk means fear. Authority offers relief. It provides a script. And scripts feel safe. This is why even intelligent people can become obedient under the right conditions. Obedience is often a stress response disguised as loyalty. One of the most disturbing demonstrations of obedience comes from Stanley Milgram's experiments in the 1960s. Participants believed they were administering painful electric shocks to another person as part of a learning experiment. An authority figure in a lab coat calmly instructed them to continue. Many participants did, even when they were visibly distressed, even when they believed they were hurting someone, even when their conscience was screaming. What matters most is not the details. What matters is the structure. 1. A perceived legitimate authority. 2. A gradual escalation. 3. A framework that normalizes compliance. 4. Responsibility shifted upward. 5. The subject trapped by incremental commitment. This is the architecture of obedience. And it appears everywhere. In workplaces. In institutions. In relationships. In cultures. Authority rarely asks for evil immediately. It asks for just this one small thing. Then another. Then another. This is critical. Because if you were asked to do something obviously extreme at the beginning, you would likely refuse. But authority works through increments. Each step becomes the new normal. Each step makes the next step easier. And by the time the line is crossed, it no longer feels like a line. It feels like continuation. This is how people become complicit. Not through one big decision, but through 1,000 small ones. Authority is not only a person. It is a symbol, a uniform, a badge, a title, a degree, a podium, a microphone, a building. Humans respond to symbols as signals of legitimacy. Because symbols reduce uncertainty. They answer the question, who is in charge? The problem is, symbols can be worn by anyone, and the nervous system responds automatically. This is why people will obey someone with a clipboard, defer to someone in a suit, trust someone with credentials, accept statements from a confident speaker, even when those signals do not guarantee truth. Confidence is often mistaken for competence. Status is often mistaken for wisdom. A key concept in obedience psychology is the idea that people enter an agentic state. Meaning, they no longer experience themselves as the primary moral agent. They become an instrument, a tool, a mechanism. I'm not doing it, I'm carrying it out. This is how good people commit harmful acts without feeling like villains. They outsource responsibility. And when responsibility is outsourced, conscience becomes quieter. Not absent. Quieter. This is why the most dangerous phrase in human history may be, I was just following orders. A key concept in obedience psychology is the idea that people enter an agentic state. Meaning, they no longer experience themselves as the primary moral agent. They become an instrument, a tool, a mechanism. I'm not doing it, I'm carrying it out. This is how good people commit harmful acts without feeling like villains. They outsource responsibility. And when responsibility is outsourced, conscience becomes quieter. Not absent. Quieter. This is why the most dangerous phrase in human history may be, "I was just following orders." Sometimes people obey because authority is persuasive, but often they obey because authority is threatening. Not always physically, sometimes socially, sometimes financially, sometimes psychologically. Authority often implies, if you resist, you will lose something. Your job, your reputation, your access, your group membership, your future security. So obedience becomes a form of self-preservation. It is not always loyalty. It is often risk reduction. And because the brain equates threat with danger, obedience becomes the easiest path to safety. Here is the uncomfortable truth. Most people do not resist authority because resistance requires psychological strength and social courage. Resistance demands tolerating conflict, tolerating uncertainty, tolerating rejection, accepting consequences, trusting your own judgment over the group's, standing alone if necessary. The herd instinct from Chapter 1 and authority dynamics from Chapter 2 reinforce each other. Authority says, do this. The group says, this is normal. Now the individual has to resist both. That is a rare psychological posture. Not impossible, but rare. Authority becomes most dangerous when it is perceived as legitimate. Because legitimacy produces automatic moral permission. People assume, if it's allowed, it must be okay. If it's official, it must be justified. If it's legal, it must be right. But legality is not morality. Official does not mean ethical. Authorized does not mean true. Yet the mind often collapses these distinctions because it reduces cognitive load. Your brain prefers simplicity. Authority provides it. When someone obeys harmful authority, they face internal conflict. They must reconcile, I am a good person, with, I am doing something harmful. To resolve this, the mind rationalizes. It's not that bad. It's necessary. They deserve it. I don't have a choice. Someone else would do it anyway. This is not always conscious lying. It is psychological self-protection. The mind edits reality to preserve identity. And once the mind rationalizes, obedience becomes easier. The conscience is soothed. The behavior continues. Authority becomes psychologically controlling when it 1. Demands obedience as virtue. 2. Punishes dissent as moral failure. 3. Frames questions as disloyalty. 4. Uses fear to compress thought. 5. Rewards compliance with belonging. When you see these patterns, you are not just seeing leadership. You are seeing psychological control. Resistance is not primarily a physical act. It is a mental act. It begins when you reclaim agency. When you stop outsourcing responsibility upward. When you ask, do I agree? Is this true? Is this ethical? What is the cost of compliance? What is the cost of refusal? True resistance is clarity plus courage. And courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision that something matters more than fear. Chapter 3, Group Identity and Moral Blindness. Why good people justify cruelty. If authority explains obedience, group identity explains something even more powerful. Why morality becomes selective. Why empathy narrows. Why good people excuse what they would normally condemn. Why cruelty can feel righteous. Because once you merge with a group, you stop protecting only your life. You begin protecting your identity. And identity protection can override truth. Group identity is not just membership. It is psychological fusion. At first, you participate. Then you belong. Then you identify. Then you merge. You stop saying, "I believe this," and start saying, "We believe this." That shift seems small, but it is structural. Because once a belief becomes we, disagreeing becomes more than disagreement. It becomes betrayal. And betrayal threatens belonging. And belonging, as we established in Chapter 1, is interpreted by the nervous system as survival. So the mind begins defending the group instinctively, not logically, instinctively. A core feature of identity is that it prefers coherence over accuracy. Truth can destabilize. Truth can require revision. Truth can imply wrongdoing. But stability feels safe. So when you join a group, your mind unconsciously begins selecting information that preserves the group's goodness, the group's correctness, the group's superiority, the group's legitimacy. This is not always manipulation. Often it is self-protection. Because if the group is wrong, and you are the group, then you are wrong. And being wrong in a group can lead to rejection. So the mind defends. Humans instinctively split reality into us, them. This is not primarily political. It is ancient. In-group bias means we interpret our side with generosity. We interpret the other side with suspicion. When we harm, it was an accident. When they harm, it was intention. When we make mistakes, it was context. When they make mistakes, it was character. Same action, different moral interpretation. That is moral distortion. And it is automatic. Empathy functions most naturally toward those we perceive as like us. This is why groups dehumanize opponents, reduce outsiders to stereotypes, use labels instead of names, describe enemies as threats rather than people. Because once the other is dehumanized, empathy is not required. And if empathy is not required, harm becomes easier. You do not need to feel cruel to be cruel. You only need to stop seeing the other as fully human. Empathy functions most naturally toward those we perceive as like us. This is why groups dehumanize opponents, reduce outsiders to stereotypes, use labels instead of names, describe enemies as threats rather than people. Because once the other is dehumanized, empathy is not required. And if empathy is not required, harm becomes easier. You do not need to feel cruel to be cruel. You only need to stop seeing the other as fully human. There is a difference between having an idea and being had by an idea. When ideology possesses you, it becomes identity. You are no longer evaluating it. You are defending it. The belief system becomes a psychological home, a structure, a refuge. And if it is threatened, you experience it as a threat to self. So you fight. Not for truth. For identity survival. In isolation, a person often asks, "Is this right?" Inside a fused group, the question becomes, "Is this loyal?" Loyalty-based morality is not conscious corruption. It is a shift in moral orientation. The group becomes the moral unit, and morality becomes tribal. When a group is challenged, the mind activates defense mechanisms. Rationalization. We had no choice. Denial. That didn't happen. Minimization. It's exaggerated. Projection. They're worse. Whataboutism. What about what they did? This isn't random argument. It's identity protection. If wrongdoing is acknowledged, the group's image fractures. If the group's image fractures, belonging becomes unstable. So the mind protects the group by distorting reality. Every group creates a narrative. Who we are, why we matter, what we stand for, who threatens us, what we must do. Once a narrative becomes sacred, criticism becomes taboo. People stop asking, "Is this true?" and start feeling, "This must be defended." Sacred narratives create moral blindness. Because you cannot investigate what you consider holy, groups maintain cohesion through shared enemies. Not always intentionally, but structurally. If there is no enemy, the group fragments. So the mind amplifies threat. The other side becomes not merely different. They become dangerous, corrupt, evil, stupid, subhuman. Threat inflation reduces complexity. Complexity weakens mobilization. So the group simplifies reality into moral binaries. Good vs evil. This is psychologically satisfying, but ethically destructive. Certainty is addictive. It provides confidence, identity, direction, belonging, meaning. When you are uncertain, you feel alone. When you are certain, you feel anchored. Groups often offer certainty, clear beliefs, clear enemies, clear rules, clear identity. This is why groups can become psychologically irresistible. Not because people love conflict, but because people fear ambiguity. And certainty feels like safety. Certainty is addictive. It provides confidence, identity, direction, belonging, meaning. When you are uncertain, you feel alone. When you are certain, you feel anchored. Groups often offer certainty, clear beliefs, clear enemies, clear rules, clear identity. This is why groups can become psychologically irresistible. Not because people love conflict, but because people fear ambiguity. And certainty feels like safety. The internet intensifies group identity. Because you are constantly rewarded for agreement, constantly punished for deviation, constantly exposed to outrage cycles, constantly surrounded by ideological reinforcement. Online environments compress nuance. They amplify extremes. They reward moral performance. They punish complexity. And they create the illusion that your group is reality itself. Because the algorithm surrounds you with confirmation, you begin living inside a constructed tribe. The most important takeaway is this: you do not need to be evil to justify harm. You only need identity fusion, moral certainty, an enemy, group permission. That combination has produced cruelty across history, again and again. The question is not, am I a good person? The question is, what conditions could make me morally blind? That is the mature question. So how do you prevent group identity from hijacking your morality? You do not isolate completely. You do not reject belonging. You develop dual loyalty. Loyalty to truth. Loyalty to people. But truth must remain above tribe. This requires 1. Noticing when you feel defensive. 2. Identifying when disagreement feels like threat. 3. Questioning whether your morality is becoming selective. 4. Maintaining relationships across ideological boundaries. 5. Resisting the seduction of certainty. The goal is not neutrality. The goal is integrity. Once you understand group identity and moral blindness, you can see how mass psychology is directed. Because groups do not become blind spontaneously. They are steered. Not always by a mastermind. Often by simple emotional mechanisms. Fear, outrage, repetition, story. Chapter 4, Propaganda and Emotional Manipulation, How the Crowd is Steered. Most people believe propaganda is something that happens to other people. To the uneducated. To the gullible. To the extreme. They imagine propaganda as crude posters, obvious lies, or authoritarian brainwashing. That belief is comforting, because it protects the ego. If I were being manipulated, I would notice. But manipulation rarely announces itself. It works precisely because it feels like your own thinking. Propaganda is not primarily about information. It is about emotion. Because the fastest way to control thought is to control the emotional state that thought emerges from. Most people believe propaganda is something that happens to other people, to the uneducated, to the gullible, to the extreme. They imagine propaganda as crude posters, obvious lies, or authoritarian brainwashing. That belief is comforting, because it protects the ego. If I were being manipulated, I would notice. But manipulation rarely announces itself. It works precisely because it feels like your own thinking. Propaganda is not primarily about information. It is about emotion. Because the fastest way to control thought is to control the emotional state that thought emerges from. Propaganda works by targeting. 1. Attention. 2. Interpretation. Attention determines what you see. Interpretation determines what you believe it means. If someone controls what you focus on, they control your sense of reality. If they control how you frame what you see, they control your meaning. And once meaning is controlled, behavior follows. Humans do not process reality primarily through facts. We process through stories. Stories compress complexity into a structure. Heroes, villains, victims, threats, salvation, destiny. A story gives emotional orientation. It tells you who to love, who to fear, who to hate, who to protect, what to sacrifice. Propaganda is often story engineering, because story bypasses analysis. It hits identity directly. Complexity weakens control, because complexity produces uncertainty. Uncertainty produces hesitation. Hesitation reduces mobilization. So propaganda simplifies. It reduces multi-causal reality to single causes. It converts nuanced conflict into moral binaries. Good vs evil. Us vs them. Truth versus corruption. Safety versus threat. Simplification creates certainty. Certainty creates unity. Unity creates obedience. The human brain uses familiarity as a shortcut for truth. If you hear something repeatedly, it begins to feel true. Not because you verified it, but because it becomes psychologically real. This is why slogans work. This is why catchphrases spread. This is why repeated narratives dominate. Repetition reduces cognitive friction. The mind stops questioning what feels familiar. It becomes part of the background reality. And background reality is rarely examined. Fear narrows attention. This is adaptive. In danger, you focus. But in propaganda, fear is weaponized. When people are afraid, they seek certainty. They seek leaders. They accept simple explanations. They tolerate control. They sacrifice freedom for safety. Fear reduces curiosity. It increases obedience. This is why crisis is a perfect environment for manipulation. Because a frightened mind does not want complexity. It wants relief. Fear narrows attention. This is adaptive. In danger, you focus. But in propaganda, fear is weaponized. When people are afraid, they seek certainty. They seek leaders. They accept simple explanations. They tolerate control. They sacrifice freedom for safety. Fear reduces curiosity. It increases obedience. This is why crisis is a perfect environment for manipulation. Because a frightened mind does not want complexity. It wants relief. Disgust is one of the most powerful tools in propaganda. Because disgust removes nuance immediately. When you feel disgust toward a person or group, you stop wanting to understand. You stop feeling curiosity. You feel rejection. Disgust creates the psychological conditions for cruelty. Because it creates the sense, they are not like us. And that is the first step toward moral permission. Framing is not lying. It is selecting which interpretation is most available. Example: a protest can be framed as freedom or chaos. A policy can be framed as protection or control. A dissenting voice can be framed as dangerous or courageous. Same event, different emotional outcome. Most people think they are reacting to facts. They are reacting to frames. Frames are invisible because they feel like common sense. Propaganda often uses moral language because morality is binding. Words like justice, safety, hate, freedom, rights, protection, truth, corruption. These words are emotionally loaded. They activate identity. They create automatic alliance or rejection. Once moral language dominates, debate becomes impossible. Because disagreement becomes not disagreement, but moral failure. If you disagree, you are not mistaken. You are bad. That is the end point of propaganda. When discussion becomes moral warfare. Propaganda often uses moral language because morality is binding. Words like justice, safety, hate, freedom, rights, protection, truth, corruption. These words are emotionally loaded. They activate identity. They create automatic alliance or rejection. Once moral language dominates, debate becomes impossible. Because disagreement becomes not disagreement, but moral failure. If you disagree, you are not mistaken. You are bad. That is the end point of propaganda. When discussion becomes moral warfare, propaganda often constructs an enemy, not just a competitor, a threat. Why? Because fear unites. A shared enemy creates cohesion. It eliminates internal conflict. It creates a reason to sacrifice. It creates a justification for control. The enemy can be real or exaggerated, but the function is the same. Group unity through threat. This is why propaganda needs a villain. A villain stabilizes the narrative. Today, propaganda is accelerated by algorithms, not always by design, but by function. Algorithms reward emotion, engagement, outrage, fear, conflict. Because emotional content retains attention. Attention generates revenue. So content that polarizes spreads faster. Meaning becomes manipulated not just by ideology, but by incentives. The system amplifies what makes you reactive, not what makes you accurate. Propaganda's final product is not belief. It is a feeling, a sense of certainty, a sense of knowing, a sense of moral clarity. People may not have facts, but they have conviction. That conviction feels like truth, but it may be only emotional certainty. And emotional certainty is often the opposite of critical thinking. The test is not, is this true? The test is, what state is this creating in me? If content causes immediate outrage, immediate disgust, immediate certainty, immediate desire to punish, immediate fear, immediate moral superiority, pause. Those are manipulation states. Not because the issue isn't real, but because your mind is being steered into predictable response. Manipulation begins when emotion bypasses reflection. When propaganda succeeds. Curiosity declines. Complexity collapses. Empathy narrows. Dissent becomes taboo. Violence becomes justifiable. The crowd becomes one organism. Easy to direct. Easy to mobilize. Easy to weaponize. Chapter 5. The Illusion of Independent Thinking. Are your beliefs actually yours? Most people believe they think for themselves. They may admit they are influenced sometimes by family, culture, media, friends. But deep down, they still feel, my beliefs are mine. That feeling is one of the strongest illusions humans live inside. Not because people are unintelligent, but because the mind's primary job is not truth. Its primary job is social survival. And social survival requires alignment. So the mind learns to imitate long before it learns to question. You inherited them. Language came before choice. Culture came before reasoning. Norms came before evaluation. Before you were capable of critical thinking, you were already absorbing. What is acceptable? What is shameful? What is admirable? What is dangerous? What is normal? What is wrong? These were not presented as hypotheses. They were presented as reality. So most beliefs are not formed by analysis. They are formed by immersion. This is the first reason independent thinking is rare. Because the foundation was laid before you had a chance to inspect it. Humans use a simple heuristic. If many people believe it, it's probably true. This is called social proof. It is efficient. You cannot verify everything. You cannot investigate every claim. So your brain uses consensus as a proxy for truth. But consensus is not truth. Consensus is agreement. And agreement can be engineered, or inherited, or biased, or manipulated. Social proof works because it once protected survival. If your tribe feared a predator in a certain area, you didn't need a debate. You needed alignment. You lived because you trusted consensus. But in modern life, the same mechanism becomes dangerous. Because consensus can be wrong, and still feel safe. Imitation is one of the earliest forms of learning. Children learn by copying. Adults do too. But adults hide imitation behind sophistication. They don't say, I copied my group. They say, I researched. I realized. It's obvious. It's common sense. Often, what they call common sense is simply deep social conditioning. When a belief feels obvious, that does not prove it is true. It may simply prove it is familiar. Most people think reasoning leads to beliefs. But often beliefs come first. Then reasoning follows as justification. This is not a moral failure. It is cognitive design. The brain forms a stance quickly, based on emotion, group identity, and familiarity. Then it generates explanations to defend that stance. Reasoning becomes a lawyer, not a judge. This is why two intelligent people can reason toward opposite conclusions. Because the reasoning is serving identity, not truth. A meme is not just an internet joke. A meme is a unit of cultural replication. Beliefs spread like viruses. Not because they are true, but because they are effective at spreading. They spread if they trigger emotion, simplify complexity, create identity, provide enemies, offer belonging, reward repetition. Truth is optional. Virality is structural. So in a mimetic environment, your mind is not choosing beliefs freely. It is being exposed to contagious narratives. And contagious narratives are designed for replication, not accuracy. Once a belief becomes identity, inquiry becomes threat. If you identify as a certain type of person, a member of a certain community, someone who sees through things, someone who is on the right side. Then changing your belief feels like losing yourself. So you defend beliefs not because they are verified, but because they stabilize identity, and identity stabilizes belonging. Beliefs become psychological shelter. You don't want them true. You want them safe. Independent thinking has a social cost. If you question your group, you risk being judged, being ridiculed, being excluded, being misunderstood, being labeled disloyal. So the mind calculates. Is it worth it? Often the answer is no. So people think inside permitted boundaries. They develop opinions that are variations of what their tribe already allows. This is not always conscious cowardice. It's nervous system logic. Isolation feels dangerous. So thought becomes socially shaped. Independent thinking has a social cost. If you question your group, you risk being judged, being ridiculed, being excluded, being misunderstood, being labeled disloyal. So the mind calculates. Is it worth it? Often the answer is no. So people think inside permitted boundaries. They develop opinions that are variations of what their tribe already allows. This is not always conscious cowardice. It's nervous system logic. Isolation feels dangerous. So thought becomes socially shaped. Borrowed beliefs have benefits: certainty, community, direction, moral clarity, simplified reality. When you adopt the tribe's belief system, you gain a ready-made identity, a ready-made enemy, a ready-made set of correct opinions. You don't have to struggle with complexity. You don't have to face uncertainty. You don't have to think alone. Borrowed belief reduces existential effort. Independent thought requires it. In modern culture, beliefs are often performed, not privately held. Performed. People display beliefs as social signals. Here is who I am. Here is my tribe. Here is my moral status. Here is what I stand for. Beliefs become badges. Once beliefs become badges, truth becomes secondary. Because the purpose is not accuracy. The purpose is identity display. And identity display is rewarded. Through belonging. Through praise. Through visibility. In modern culture, beliefs are often performed, not privately held. Performed. People display beliefs as social signals. Here is who I am. Here is my tribe. Here is my moral status. Here is what I stand for. Beliefs become badges. Once beliefs become badges, truth becomes secondary. Because the purpose is not accuracy. The purpose is identity display. And identity display is rewarded. Through belonging. Through praise. Through visibility. Independent thinking is not rejecting everything. It's not contrarianism. It's not skepticism as performance. Independent thinking is the ability to hold uncertainty without panic. Examine evidence without identity defense. Revise beliefs without shame. Separate truth-seeking from belonging-seeking. Resist emotional steering. Notice when you want to believe something because it feels good. Independent thinking is emotional maturity, not just intelligence. The moment you realize, my beliefs might be inherited, something changes. You stop assuming certainty equals truth. You begin asking, where did this belief come from? What emotional state supports it? Who benefits if I believe it? What evidence would change my mind? Am I willing to be wrong publicly? Those questions are the beginning of sovereignty, not rebellion. Sovereignty. Chapter 6, Crowd Behavior and Psychological Regression. Why Groups Become Irrational Overnight. An individual can be intelligent. A crowd can be stupid. Not because intelligence disappears, but because the psychological conditions that support intelligence collapse under certain group dynamics. This is one of the most unsettling realities in mass psychology. When people merge into crowds, they often regress. Not into childishness exactly, into something more primitive, more reactive, more emotional, more impulsive, more certain. Crowds do not simply amplify what individuals already are. They transform what individuals become. A crowd behaves like a single organism. It develops a shared emotional tone, a shared narrative, a shared enemy, a shared goal, a shared sense of righteousness. The individual becomes a cell inside that organism. And once you are a cell, your primary function is not to reflect. It is to contribute. The crowd's emotional momentum becomes the guiding force. And resisting that momentum feels like resisting gravity. A crowd behaves like a single organism. It develops a shared emotional tone, a shared narrative, a shared enemy, a shared goal, a shared sense of righteousness. The individual becomes a cell inside that organism. And once you are a cell, your primary function is not to reflect. It is to contribute. The crowd's emotional momentum becomes the guiding force. And resisting that momentum feels like resisting gravity. When you are alone, your behavior feels like yours. When you are in a crowd, responsibility disperses. Your mind quietly says, "This isn't on me." Even if you participate, even if you chant, even if you mock, even if you throw the first stone, even if you share the misinformation. Because the crowd creates psychological cover. This is why individuals do things in groups they would never do in isolation. Not because they suddenly became monsters, but because accountability feels diluted. And when accountability fades, conscience weakens. Emotions spread through groups like pathogens. This is not metaphor. It is observable. Humans unconsciously mimic facial expressions, tone of voice, body posture, emotional rhythms. When enough people display a shared emotion, it becomes contagious. Fear spreads, anger spreads, excitement spreads, outrage spreads. And once the emotional temperature rises, thought compresses. The crowd's emotion becomes the individual's emotion, often without awareness. This is why people later say, "I don't know what came over me. Something did. The group did." Crowds cannot hold nuance. Nuance slows momentum. Momentum is the crowd's fuel. So crowds simplify. They turn complex issues into slogans. They reduce individuals to labels. They collapse moral ambiguity into certainty. Why? Because simplicity coordinates action. A crowd needs a clear enemy, a clear goal, a clear story. Ambiguity fragments unity. So ambiguity is rejected. This is why crowds often become hostile toward questions, nuance, dissent, hesitation, complexity. Those things threaten cohesion. And cohesion is the crowd's identity. Crowds do not only produce danger, they produce pleasure. The pleasure of belonging, the pleasure of shared rhythm, the pleasure of synchronized emotion, the pleasure of feeling part of something larger. This pleasure can be intoxicating. It replaces loneliness with fusion. It replaces uncertainty with certainty. It replaces fragmented identity with collective identity. For many people, crowd belonging feels like psychological relief. That relief can become addictive, because unity feels like meaning. When emotional intensity rises in a crowd, the nervous system shifts. The reflective mind weakens. the reactive mind strengthens. In other words, the primitive brain takes over, not because people lose intelligence permanently, but because under high arousal, the brain prioritizes threat detection, alliance formation, enemy identification, immediate action. Reflection is slow. Emotion is fast. Crowds are fast systems. So the crowd privileges the fast brain. This is why mobs form quickly, why moral outrage escalates rapidly, why cruelty can emerge overnight. The crowd is a nervous system event, not just a social event. Crowds often require an enemy. An enemy organizes emotion. It gives direction to anger. It unifies disagreement. It stabilizes narrative. But to attack an enemy without guilt, the enemy must be psychologically reduced. So crowds dehumanize. They convert people into symbols. Traitors, criminals, parasites, animals, threats, evil. Once a person is framed as symbol, empathy fades. And once empathy fades, cruelty becomes easier. Dehumanization is not a moral accident. It is a coordination tool. Online environments intensify crowd psychology. Why? Because anonymity increases de-individuation. Speed reduces reflection. Social reward systems amplify aggression. Outrage spreads algorithmically. Punishment feels immediate and public. Online mobs form rapidly, and they do not require physical proximity. 1,000 people can converge emotionally within minutes. And because online participation feels less real, conscience weakens further. The person becomes a profile, a handle, a clip, a screenshot. The crowd consumes the symbol, not the human. Crowds often adopt a morality of purity. They divide the world into righteous, contaminated. Once contamination is identified, the crowd demands cleansing. This is why crowds are drawn to punishment. Punishment restores moral clarity. Punishment reinforces unity. Punishment proves loyalty. And the crowd experiences punishment as justice. Even when it is excessive. Even when it is cruel. Even when it is inaccurate. Crowds do not primarily seek truth. They seek cohesion. The ego wants to believe, I would never be part of that. But the honest truth is, under the right conditions, almost anyone can be pulled into crowd psychology. If fear is high, if belonging is threatened, if uncertainty is strong, if the enemy is clear, if the group is unified, if responsibility is diffused, most people will drift. Not consciously choosing cruelty, but being carried by momentum. The question is not, am I good? The question is, what conditions make me regress? That is the mature question. Resistance begins with awareness of the state. Crowds hijack you by controlling your arousal. So the first defense is state regulation. If you feel immediate outrage, immediate certainty, immediate desire to punish, disgust toward a group, pleasure in humiliation, pause. Those are crowd states. Then ask, 1. What emotion is dominating me? 2. What narrative is being offered? 3. Who is being reduced to symbol? 4. What is being simplified? 5. What would I think if I were alone, calm, and unobserved? The aim is not neutrality. It is clarity. Chapter 7. Fear, Crisis and the Psychology of Control. Why uncertainty makes people obedient. Fear is not just an emotion. Fear is a reorganization of the mind. It changes what you notice. It changes what you value. It changes what you tolerate. It changes what you obey. In a calm state, people want freedom. In a fearful state, people want relief. And relief often arrives in the form of certainty, authority, and control. This is why crises are not just events. They are psychological environments. And in those environments, mass behavior becomes predictable. When fear activates, the brain shifts priorities. Complexity becomes unbearable. Ambiguity becomes intolerable. Nuance becomes irritating. The mind begins searching for clear answers, strong leaders, simple explanations, quick solutions, visible enemies. Fear narrows attention. This is adaptive in real danger. But in social systems, it creates a vulnerability. A fearful population becomes easy to steer. Because fear reduces thinking. It increases urgency. And urgency bypasses reflection. In crisis, humans often face a trade, whether they admit it or not. Freedom feels uncertain. Safety feels structured. When fear is high, people become willing to exchange privacy for protection, autonomy for guidance, complexity for certainty, skepticism for reassurance. This exchange can be rational in real threats. But psychologically, it has a cost. The more fear rises, the more people accept control that would otherwise feel unacceptable. And once control is normalized, it rarely disappears easily. In crisis, humans often face a trade, whether they admit it or not. Freedom feels uncertain. Safety feels structured. When fear is high, people become willing to exchange privacy for protection, autonomy for guidance, complexity for certainty, skepticism for reassurance. This exchange can be rational in real threats. But psychologically, it has a cost. The more fear rises, the more people accept control that would otherwise feel unacceptable. And once control is normalized, it rarely disappears easily. There is a psychological pattern seen repeatedly. When uncertainty rises, authoritarian appeal increases. Why? Because authoritarianism offers clear rules, clear roles, clear enemies, clear narratives, clear punishments. It removes ambiguity. It compresses reality into simple categories. In a fearful mind, simplicity feels like oxygen. This is why during crisis, people often gravitate toward strong leaders, strict policies, harsh punishments, moral certainty, scapegoats, even if those choices reduce freedom. Because fear makes freedom feel risky. Fear demands a target. If fear is diffuse and uncertain, it becomes unbearable. So the mind searches for a cause, a face, a group, a villain. Scapegoats reduce anxiety because they provide explanation, direction, unity, moral clarity. Once an enemy is identified, fear transforms into anger. And anger feels powerful. Fear feels helpless. So populations often prefer anger. Because anger produces action. This is why crisis narratives often create enemies. Sometimes real. Sometimes exaggerated. Sometimes invented. The function is the same. Reduce uncertainty by assigning blame. Under fear, moral boundaries shift. People tolerate actions they would reject in calm states. This is not because they became immoral. It is because their priorities reorganized. In emergency mind, the hierarchy becomes survival, liberty, order, debate, unity, dissent, security, privacy, action, reflection. This is why in fear, people may support censorship to stop misinformation, punishment to restore order, exclusion to protect the group, surveillance to keep us safe. Fear converts moral reasoning into survival reasoning. In calm times, dissent is annoying. In crisis, dissent feels dangerous. Because dissent introduces uncertainty, and uncertainty is already intolerable. So the group reacts aggressively to questioning. Not because questioning is always wrong, but because questioning threatens emotional stability. In fear states, people often confuse disagreement with threat. So dissenters become framed as selfish, dangerous, disloyal, irresponsible, even if they are asking valid questions. The crowd is protecting emotional coherence, not necessarily truth. Control is sedating. When someone else is handling it, anxiety decreases. When strict rules are imposed, the mind relaxes. Not because rules are always good, but because rules reduce ambiguity. Ambiguity is psychologically exhausting under fear. So people crave structure. They want schedules, rules, restrictions, clear boundaries. It feels like containment. Containment reduces panic. This is why crisis environments often increase tolerance for strict systems. People are not only obeying, they are relieved. Here is the dangerous loop. 1. Fear rises. 2. People demand control. 3. Control increases. 4. The system emphasizes threat to justify control. 5. Fear remains elevated. 6. Control becomes normalized. This is how emergency conditions become permanent mindsets. A population can become habituated to fear. And habituated fear produces chronic obedience. Not because people are weak, but because their nervous system is stuck in threat mode. Fear is amplified through attention. Whatever you repeatedly focus on becomes your perceived reality. So constant exposure to threats creates a heightened threat model. Even if objective danger is low, perceived danger becomes high. And perceived danger drives behavior more than objective danger. This is why mass systems can steer populations through constant crisis framing, repetitive threat messaging, dramatic narratives, moral panic cycles. The mind cannot remain calm when it is fed fear continuously. Not everyone becomes obedient in fear. Resistance often comes from stronger internal locus of control, emotional regulation ability, stable identity not fused to tribe, experience with propaganda and manipulation, willingness to tolerate uncertainty, moral courage to endure social rejection. Resistance is less about intelligence, more about nervous system stability and identity independence. People who can hold ambiguity are harder to control, because ambiguity does not panic them. Chronic fear produces rigidity, polarization, scapegoating, social fragmentation, obedience to simplistic narratives, decreased empathy. Fear makes people easier to steer, but it also damages their ability to think independently. A fearful society becomes less creative, less curious, more reactive, more tribal. This is not just political. It is psychological. Sovereignty does not mean rejecting safety. It means refusing fear-based thinking. In crisis, ask 1. What is the objective risk vs perceived risk? 2. What emotions are shaping my interpretation? 3. Who benefits from this fear staying high? 4. What freedoms am I trading away, and will they return? 5. Am I thinking or reacting? The goal is not cynicism. It is clarity. You can take threats seriously without surrendering autonomy. Chapter 8. Psychological Sovereignty, Staying Awake in a Conforming World. If you understand mass psychology deeply enough, you eventually reach an uncomfortable realization. You are not fighting a few bad ideas. You are living inside systems that shape minds. Belonging pressures you. Authority seduces you. Groups absorb you. Propaganda steers you. Crowds regress you. Fear compresses you. None of this requires a villain. It requires only human nature interacting with incentives. So the final question is not, how do we stop mass psychology? You can't. The question is, how do you stay conscious inside it? That is psychological sovereignty, not isolation, not rebellion for its own sake, not superiority. Sovereignty. Psychological sovereignty is not distrusting everything, rejecting all groups, becoming contrarian, living without influence, being emotionally detached, never being manipulated. That is fantasy. You will be influenced. You will feel pulls. You will sometimes get swept up. Sovereignty is not perfection. It is awareness plus recovery speed. Sovereignty means you notice the pull faster. You regulate your state sooner. You update your beliefs more honestly. You refuse identity fusion. You keep truth above tribe. You protect your mind from emotional hijacking. The sovereign mind is not immune. It is trained. Thought follows state. If you are outraged, your reasoning narrows. If you are afraid, your curiosity collapses. If you are humiliated, your defenses activate. Most people try to think clearly while dysregulated. That's like trying to see through muddy water without letting it settle. The first act of sovereignty is state regulation. When you feel urgent certainty, immediate disgust, compulsive need to punish, moral superiority, panic, tribal rage, that is not truth. That is a state. So the first move is not debate. It is regulation. Breathe. Pause. Delay response. Sovereignty begins when you refuse to act inside hijacked states. Humans mix these constantly. Belonging-seeking asks, what will my group approve? Truth-seeking asks, what is most accurate? Most people think they are truth-seeking when they're actually belonging-seeking. You can detect this by one question. Does changing my mind threaten my identity or relationships? If yes, then your belief is not just intellectual. It is social. And social beliefs are defended differently. Sovereignty means being able to revise beliefs without social panic. That requires emotional strength, not just intellect. Most people have physical hygiene. Few people have mental hygiene. Belief hygiene means you treat beliefs like inputs that can be contaminated, not morally contaminated, cognitively contaminated. Ask routinely, where did I learn this? What emotions make this belief feel true? What evidence would falsify it? What am I ignoring because it's inconvenient? What would someone intelligent on the other side say? The sovereign mind does not protect beliefs. It tests them. Fusion happens when disagreement feels like attack. When criticism feels like annihilation. When your beliefs become you. Identity fusion creates rigidity, aggression, and moral blindness. The sovereign mind holds identity lightly. It can say, I might be wrong. I'm still learning. I don't need certainty to be stable. That sentence alone breaks the spell of group possession. Because ideology feeds on identity rigidity. Narratives spread because they serve something. Sometimes they serve power. Sometimes they serve profit. Sometimes they serve cohesion. Sometimes they serve status. You do not need conspiracy thinking. You need incentive thinking. Ask, who benefits if I stay angry? Who benefits if I stay afraid? Who benefits if I stop questioning? Who benefits if my group is polarized? When you track incentives, you see the machinery, not just the message. This is one of the strongest protections against moral blindness. Because contact with real humans dissolves caricatures. Tribes turn people into symbols. Relationships turn symbols back into humans. You don't need to agree with everyone, but you need exposure to complexity. If your entire social environment shares one ideology, you are vulnerable. Not because the ideology is necessarily wrong, but because your mind loses calibration. Diversity of perspective is cognitive strength. Ambiguity tolerance is a rare trait, and it is one of the strongest predictors of sovereignty. Crowds demand certainty. Propaganda offers certainty. Authority provides certainty. But reality often remains probabilistic. If you cannot tolerate uncertainty, you will cling to any narrative that relieves it. So sovereignty requires practice. Sitting with "I don't know yet." Holding tension without rushing to conclusion. Allowing complexity without simplifying into enemies. The sovereign mind can breathe in uncertainty. That is why it cannot be easily controlled. Crowd morality is tribal. Sovereign morality is principled. Tribal morality asks, what benefits us? Principled morality asks, what is right even if it costs us? Principles create consistency. They prevent selective ethics. They reduce moral hypocrisy. Your principles must be defined deliberately, not inherited, not copied, not performed. Real principles cost something. That's how you know they're real. Fast thinking is efficient. It's also easily manipulated. Sovereignty requires deliberate, slow thinking, verifying before reacting, waiting before sharing, questioning before condemning, investigating before concluding. The sovereign mind doesn't reward itself for being first. It rewards itself for being accurate. Everyone has vulnerabilities. Need for belonging. Need for status. Fear of rejection. Need for certainty. Desire for superiority. Unresolved shame. Unprocessed trauma. Manipulation targets weak points. So sovereignty requires self-knowledge. Ask, what kind of content hijacks me fastest? What makes me feel morally superior? What triggers my fear of exclusion? What threatens my identity? If you don't know your vulnerabilities, someone else will exploit them. Not always intentionally, but structurally. A sovereign person is not isolated. They can belong without dissolving. They can follow without surrendering conscience. They can respect authority without outsourcing morality. They can engage narratives without being possessed by them. They can feel emotions without becoming them. They can participate without losing themselves. This is the real goal. Not to escape society, but to remain awake inside it. Here is the final test of psychological sovereignty. Can you stay honest when honesty costs you belonging? Because that is where most people collapse. Not because they are weak. Because belonging feels like survival. But if you can tolerate the pain of temporary disapproval, if you can risk social friction, if you can stand alone for truth when needed, then you are free. Not politically, psychologically. Ask yourself, where do I confuse agreement with truth? Where does my tribe influence my morality? What states hijack my thinking fastest? What beliefs do I hold that I'm afraid to question? Who would I be if I didn't need approval to be stable? Sovereignty does not mean you never fall into the crowd. It means you wake up faster. And waking up faster changes your life. Because you stop living as a predictable product of mass forces. You begin living as a conscious individual inside them.